Hope I'll be able to give you a little bit of perspective on what's going on in the international markets. When they were given my topic, I got to thinking about what about demand? I'm not sure that there is a lot of demand out there from a consumer's perspective. We'll talk about that. I think there's a commercial perspective when we talk about animal ID and traceability. But a lot of that, I think, is really about expectations on the consumer. And they expect their governments to do something, protect them in some way. Now, they do have choices out there from a commercial standpoint. We'll explore those different things as we look at the different things that are going on internationally. I'm going to take you down the road of what various countries are doing relative to traceability and animal ID. I'll tell you right off the bat, most countries that are in the exporting business have mandatory programs. So we'll talk about that, and I'll kind of show you what they're doing. They aren't necessarily 100%, as you might expect, from birth to say, the consumer's plate. But there are fragments or remnants of that as we'll kind of break those apart and look at the different things that are going on. There are world standards. Again, the terminology, I think, is a little bit questioning here. Are they really a standard? I think when we Americans think of a standard, we think of a rule that will be probably regulated in some form. That isn't necessarily true here. Most of the times, these probably have more of a perspective as a guideline. And in fact, these three organizations, the World Trade Organization, the OIE, and Codex, which Codex has kind of stepped up here in the last few years as taking on more of these guidelines that can be turned into standards. They're a guideline that a government may, foreign government may want, or for that matter, the U.S. government may want to take on and turn into their regulations. So it gives them some guidance in terms of meeting some world standards. I want you to focus a little bit on that first one. That's probably the basis that I would like you to remember as I go through the talk, because we're going to talk about those things in a lot of different perspectives. Usually there needs to be a scientific reason for doing it. It can't be trade restrictive, meaning that a lot of countries can do it. And in these days, a lot of times that means underdeveloped countries can do that. Sometimes they have special provisions for them to be able to do that. And they can't enforce anything more rigorous than the standards they're putting on their own country. Okay, so for imported products coming in, they can't be any tougher than what they're doing to their own products that are produced in country. The big thing there is they've got to be transparent. They've got to be well published and translated, and everybody's got to understand that. So keep that in mind as we go through this. The OIE, yes, you probably talked about this quite a bit in probably many of your meetings. There are some standards out there, and some of the code, as they call it, there are procedures that you need to follow to trace animals for animal disease purposes. And I think that's a lot of your focus that you've had over this morning and throughout the course of your meeting. You'll be talking about a lot of the animal disease issues. Codex has set up some new procedures. Again, you can see a lot of the terminology that I just mentioned relative to the WTO, that they should not be any tougher than what they're asking their own country to be doing. It should be able to be traceable, and they're only recommending one step back or one step forward. So that immediately leads you to believe the Codex is probably looking more towards a food traceability relative to recall procedures. And again, you can see they ask that they be transparent, not trade restrictive, so on and so forth. The way I look at traceability and animal identification worldwide is that I kind of break it down into three categories. And I know you talked earlier about the animal disease control and zoonotic conditions. Definitely that's a big reason for doing that, and definitely that is what goes out in the international world, because I believe the OIE has in the neighborhood of probably 170 members. And they all pretty much follow some format of their recommendations. Food safety is a little bit different. A lot of countries are not as advanced in food safety controls and procedures as we are. And it breaks down into the basic categories you have there, chemical and sanitary issues. The chemical issue is probably becoming a little more easy. As you might well know, in the last couple of years, that's given us a few scares. I don't know how many of you had melamine in your vocabulary, but you probably have it in it today. And that has raised awareness, and that's probably one of the awareness issues that is out there relative to consumer demand, is that they're aware. And they want some protection from that kind of a situation. So I'm going to try and show you some of the things that are going on relative to what countries are doing relative to food safety. I think one thing, I'll just be very blunt with you right off the bat, in many of these countries, the level of scientific knowledge or scientific understanding is called zero tolerance. And as you all imagine, that can be very difficult. They don't have a very good scientific basis to, or let's just call it a risk-based basis to manage some of those things. So their solution, everything has to be zero. And that can be problematic. And we'll talk about that in some detail here a little longer. Ultimately, I call it recall procedures. Excuse me if I'm not using the right terminology. It could be withdrawal, but it also could be recall situations where governments will require the product to be moved somewhere else for whatever reason. Or it could be done commercially, which we think of that in terms of a withdrawal, where the company voluntarily pulls the product for normally specification errors. One area I do not want to forget, and that's the commercial piece. This is probably the area where we have the most sound ground in a lot of our programs, and that's through branded programs. I'll lump that into a lot of those that have detailed traceability programs are probably your natural programs that we have today. Let's not also forget the traceability we use in our production through genetic programs. A lot of breed associations do a fantastic job of requiring traceability of that genetics. We even see that as that genetics moves into the foreign markets. Starting off with one more thing, I want to break it down a little bit more into three categories. You guys have probably spoken a lot, and probably will throughout the course of your meeting, on the regulatory piece of that. So I'm not going to spend any time hardly at all on that, just point out a couple of things that are going on in the international markets. An area you may not have thought about is private standards. And Rob, who will be following me here in just a few minutes, works for a company that is working in that particular area. And that these we'll talk about the detail on that, but they are companies that have are multinational, and they're trying to set some fairly uniform standards. Which one do they use? What country do they use? Are there enough international standards for them to use? So that's something, an area I think we've got to look at, because we're seeing more and more of that in our marketplace today, where private standards, or recommendations if you will, are coming about, particularly in animal welfare, food safety, and of course product specs and quality. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the commercial piece of that, which is through marketings and production standards. Not to belabor it, but I think you all know that this is probably one of the key issues where you've been working. These are obviously, we have diseases of concern that need to be controlled and be able to track those, have good surveillance, contain those things. From an international perspective, this is very critical. Two pieces of this is very important for us to export products to other countries. One is the products have to be approved under the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Secondly, they have to have an export certificate. The export certificate is negotiated by almost every country. I wish we had equivalency in all countries, but I can't think of one where we have 100% equivalency. And we have a list of about 80 countries that USDA has a book about that thick, if you printed it out, that has all of the differences between equivalency and what we have to do to meet those requirements. In almost all cases, all of the animal disease requirements are listed on those certificates that you can imagine for various reasons. Some on there you probably would raise your eyebrows and go, why are we doing that? That hasn't been a disease in the United States for years. Trichina is a pretty good example of that. We have 5 countries that we have to meet Trichina requirements for. And I don't think we've had a reported case in Trichina in pork in millions of years maybe. I'm not sure. It's been a long time. Food safety. Again, this probably is one where we get more influence from the consumer than anywhere else. 2 reasons. That in the light blue there are the reasons. They want to be assured that the judicious use of the compounds and that there was responsible application. And I think our industry does a wonderful job of that through our PQA and PQA Plus and our BQA programs. There's a lot of assurances in there. But how do you prove that? Do we all hold up our certificate that says we went through the program? How do you do that with consumers? So that's one area where consumers do have some concern. Second piece is, and again I'm talking about mainly, is there something in that meat that shouldn't be there? Some kind of a residue. Second one is the GPP, the good production practices and GMPs, which really boil down to food safety management practices. We are more familiar in calling that HACCP programs and what have you. That's the other piece. They want to make sure that food is safe. 2 concerns that consumers have is there a long-term health problem I'm going to get by consuming this food? Secondly, is there an immediate sickness that I'm going to get? And obviously bacteria tends to give them that immediate concern because they can have the illness pretty quick. The long-term one is the scary one, and that's the residues. And that's worldwide, and it has been elevated to a much higher degree because of the melamine issues and the other situations that are going on in our world today. Again, how do you prove that you've met those standards? Part of that could be done commercially. Part of that can be done with a little thing that we call the USDA Federal Meat Inspection stamp, or the bug. A lot of times that is adequate to say that provides that consumer with those assurances. Well, and today we tend to have to deal with that. This is a listing we get out of one of our foreign markets, and you can see that those foreign markets are starting to test for things. And we can see those circled items, a couple of chemical compounds, and a couple of bacteria. If you move over to the red circle, you can see they suspended those plants because they found a violation in that. Again, their ability to tell us, maybe they'd be able to tell us what product code that came from or what date. So we do have that capability of moving one step forward for our benefit, or one step back from the importer standpoint or importing country standpoint. But what kind of corrective action do you put forward from this? What kind of controls do you have in place to prevent these from happening again? So those are the questions that we look at from a food safety standpoint. I can tell you right now that the scrutiny on this is pretty strong. Residue sampling is up a bunch. And you can see from this list that we have Japan, Russia, Korea, Canada, EU, China, Taiwan, and Mexico with current testing programs. And this has kind of evolved in the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years, where they've increased the testing on a lot of different products, mostly animal health compounds. We have a couple countries that take micronutrients. Mexico tends to give us some problems on copper, which is amazing to me that we would ever have a problem with that. Sometimes I think they're just playing with us, but no doubt we have further advancements in these programs. As you can see, that there's new WTO notices. So they're being transparent, if you remember that piece, and strengthening their programs where they're going to be additional testing. The reason why, take a look at the picture there. That's a feed bag from Vietnam, and over half of the print is just a list of antibiotics that are being used in that ration, just loaded with everything. So this particular country is using the excuse of instead of good husbandry, they just load up these animals with drugs. So it's no wonder that when these products get in the marketplace, consumers worldwide have concerns about that. And, thank God that's not our country, but we have to compete against that kind of a scenario. Second thing is the standard, in this case this is a standard, are different. And this is something that our government will have to deal with. When you look at the Codex standards, which are those in purple, you can see they're much tighter than what we have with FDA. Guess what we're being subjected to in the international market? That's right, Codex. So we have challenges here. And one thing that's nice about it, we've worked very closely with our livestock producing organizations, and likewise the pharmaceutical industry. There's been adjustments to maybe withdrawal periods and things of that nature. I think the message you've got to be cautious with, particularly when we talk about traceability, is we're starting to get this demand, or this influence, let's call it influence for right now, that is starting to move back from the plants and starting to move into our animal sectors relative to what production practice we have, and that proof that we are following through with a lot of those procedures. I think one of the things we've got to really start understanding, and this is going to be very critical. I did some hip pocket math here, so excuse me if I'm not quite right. Those of you that are yield experts can correct me. But I think we all need to understand the magnitude of what's going out there on a daily basis. One beef carcass probably gets broken down into 60 primal cuts. Some of you are probably shaking your head. Well, don't forget the variety meats. Most of the variety meats are not consumed in this country. They go somewhere else. And there's probably a list of almost maybe 15 or 20 of those things. We can't ignore those. So we've got 60 primal cuts. Those are probably going to get converted into 250 retail cuts and enter the marketplace. We have a 100,000 head kill, harvest. That's 6 million primal cuts that enter the marketplace at some point, maybe for further processing. That they eventually will turn into 25 million retail cuts. In pork, we probably have 40 primals, 70 retail cuts. Again, pork gets a little bit changed because I think about 60% of the hog carcass goes into processing. So we get ham and bacon and sausage. About 420,000 head daily harvest. That's 16 million primal cuts and 29 million retail cuts. So we're putting a lot of product out there from one animal that we got to try and track. If you want to look at it from a food safety or possibly a recall situation. So that's a pretty big challenge. Foreign countries don't have that. Number one, they don't break their animals down that much. I was in Europe about a year ago. They pretty much cut down the loin and the round on a beef carcass. Everything else goes to grind. Brings up the other question. I asked Rob just a moment ago what he thought the daily grind is, if you will. How many pounds of hamburger we make a day. Let's see what we say, Rob. It was 30 million? 300 million? Yeah, 300 million pounds of ground beef a day. Most countries that do make grind product probably don't just ignore the traceability on that, because you've got too much, you've got 100,000 head in that 300 million pounds. How do you trace it? Rob and I used to work together on some ground beef issues, and Rob came up with this idea that you could actually have the layers within a combo of trim and probably come fairly close within, I can't remember what it was, 10 or 15 head of what it actually was, because it's a continuous process. But again, the markers are not there. How do you move things? If you're going to move back through the system, how do you do that through the way we fabricate products and break them up? That is a challenge we really have in front of us today. The next topic I want to touch on is private standards. And I think this is somewhere, maybe some areas you all haven't been touched on a whole lot. Rob may touch on that when he talks about some of the things his company does. But basically, this is where we have so many multinational companies. What do they use as the guideline? What do they use as the standard? And the thing is that this has to be some working where governments to government have to be working together, as well as business to businesses. And I think one of the things that's key here is that probably as we look into the future here, another challenge for you all is these private standards will probably have a traceability component in it of some form, whether that be for animal welfare, if that is for food safety reasons, for maybe commercial specification reasons. I don't know. I can tell you right now that the grinders of ground beef have a traceability requirement on their testing for E. coli 015787. So those pieces are there. Those remnants are there. We are also seeing that in the marketplace today, internationally, where pieces of those requirements. And granted, this is more focused on the food side, as Dr. Atchison was talking about. But by the same token, we're talking about how do we do traceability in the total marketplace. Oops. This may be a little bit old, but that kind of gives you the magnitude of this international marketplace. Those little initials there in the far right-hand box, that's the various countries that these companies have holdings in. So you can see where do they need to set their standards, at what level. Also note that I think 7 out of the 8 have holdings in the United States. So at any point in time, these private standards could be applied to us. I think we're already seeing that today. I think some of these companies have been pretty aggressive in using private standards, particularly for the animal welfare issues. What's next? Possibly with food safety? So I think those are some, again, I think that's a challenge that you all may want to consider. Commercial. Commercial, I think, is one of our success stories. We probably have the best traceability in a lot of these programs from a commercial standpoint. A lot of these are through our natural programs. In the animal world, to a certain extent, I guess, organic programs, I think they're smaller. But you know what? This is not just a little niche market, small company business anymore. There's a lot of big companies that got their logo up there. So it's a business that's growing. People keep saying it's small, but I think it's still growing. Internationally, it's a little bit difficult. The word natural just doesn't translate very well. You know, the consumer will go, well, how can it not be natural? It came from the earth. It came from Mother Nature. It's natural. So what we have done is, and when we use that as a marketing term, that gets to be a little bit confusing for international consumers and regulators. So that we have some difficulty with that program there. But I think the history here is pretty good. All of these are PVP programs, process verification programs through the federal government. And I'll talk a lot about that today, that really this is a program that has had some success for us internationally. We have some other forms that work very, very well in this kind of a format. The last area under commercial is the production improvement. You all probably know much more about this than I do, but I think these are situations where we do a good job of tracking our animals and tracking our genetics through herd registries. We also use that as we export that genetics overseas and what have you. So I think this is an area that you all, I'm just making you aware that that is part of the total equation. Let's talk a little bit about where we're at today and who does what out there. If we look today, we have 3 international programs or export programs that are under the PVP process. Our good government has a gazillion initials I can go through here, but you have the process verification program is the basic one. You have the QSA, the quality systems, can't think where the A is, but that they are all part of this family of programs that under the international umbrella you have to meet. The foundation of them is all to meet certain requirements, that these animals are under 30 months of age for export of beef to a lot of these programs due to the BSE situation. To date, Japan, we have a date verified program. Cattle just basically have to be less than 21 months of age because that country believes that animals between 21 and 30 months of age are susceptible. They could be a problem. So we have to have a program that separates them. And I'll show you some details on that in just a moment. Our other program is that we have a EU program. Again, those of you that were ever hoping that the hormone battle would go away probably won't. We were doing some other things, took other routes. No sense in keep fighting them in the world market. That is a market that probably wouldn't accept hormone-treated meat anyhow. The consumers know too much about it. We've fought it too many times, over 15 years in the public. We have other plans that we can do. The program is much simpler to get into, although there are complications in doing that program. The non-hormone treated program, or the NHTC, is very detailed, but it is from birth origin all the way up through the package. The Europeans, and I'll talk about that in detail later, but they are working on programs to take it further into the retail market. Hong Kong does a nice simple one. Hong Kong just does one step back as we soften the recommendation through Codex. There you go. That's kind of the details of the program you want to get into when you try to get into the Japan program. Keep in mind that in going to Japan, you can go 2 routes. You can use the carcass maturity, if you would like, which we call A40, or you can go through all of this. Now, you don't have to do every little detail here, but there's combinations of these things at every level that you must have to do that. So when you do get into these programs commercially, they can be expensive, but you need to be sure that there's a net return that is beneficial. I think I'm amazed at how much this has grown even in a tight market over the last couple of years, and how many more cattle are actually being offered and purchased for date verification out there today. Likewise with the NHTC for Europe. We're seeing more and more cattle being placed for that. A lot of times what they'll do is that the producers don't put any hormones in them, hormonal implants, and they're offering them for either natural or NHTC. So they have 2 marketing options to go with them. But also they have their traceability hooked onto that also, which may be some benefit from them from a commercial standpoint. Delving into a little bit about what's going on in each country, I was speaking a little bit about Europe. Basically, what Europe calls their new program, they have a new name for it, they call it Traces. You all may have heard that as the passport, and there you see the passport in the picture. I believe the animals have to have the 2 ear tags in their ears within 48 hours after birth, and the passport filled out. It accompanies the animal through any movements that it takes up until the point of harvest. They are working, and I'll show you that example in just a second. Just let me make a comment. We are seeing some commercial activity relative to this. Here's a label off of a product out of Tesco. Tesco is one of the largest retailers in Great Britain as well as the rest of the world. what they're setting up right now, there's no traceability back to the farm or anything. It just goes back to the plant. Right underneath the barcode, you probably can't read it, but if you can see the barcode underneath there, it tells you where the product was cut and slaughtered. They will be adding some other information beyond that as they start working through the system. But note the testimonial there by the farmer. He's part of their system. So we're seeing that private standards start to evolve over in Europe with this kind of a system. Where they're moving towards this is a barcoding system. Over here we call that UCC. Over there is the EAN. They're basically the same. Everything you buy has that code on it today. Literally everything you buy. It's a universal system. It's been in place probably about 20 years now. All of our meat products have it on it today. It's very useful. If you're not familiar with it, down in that lower right-hand corner, the first set of digits is the plant or the manufacturing unit, and the next, 246 numbers is the product code. And you can get all kinds of information from that hooks up to other barcodes throughout the production scheme. Very useful. Probably another thing that may be something that we need to look at. Again, all of our products have that kind of a system on it today. Canada, I think you have a speaker later in the meeting, so I won't go into detail on this. Basically, they do have a mandatory program. They are a competitor of ours as well as a trading partner of ours. So they can be influential in what we may want to do because we may have to meet their standards. However, at this point in time, there has not been any discussion of that. Right now, their system goes through the point of slaughter or on live animals at the exporting port. South America, good question. Not real sure. What they tell us is that they're basically meeting that EU requirement, which I just explained to you. I think they have some difficulty in doing that a lot. They get a lot of plants delisted for not following through with the procedures properly. They have a lot of problems with that. So it looks like they need to enhance their programs a little bit. The Uruguayan, which is that grass turning into barcode logo, which I think is a rather unique message that sends that we're taking nature right back to the consumer, and they're using that barcode as a very consumer-oriented logo. They seem to be very up to speed on their traceback procedures. They tend to stay in the market. They're following through very well with a lot of their animal disease conditions. They're world exporters. Not a real large exporter, but they are getting products all over the world. Australia's focus has mainly been on food safety, which is probably a wise move on their part. They do have some voluntary, and it's hard to decipher. I think right now they pretty much have a mandatory system in place with various programs. They are trying to enhance their program at all times, and they do really advertise it as being able to comply with their trading partners. Exports are their business, and they do a very good job at it. And this is one key piece that we have to compete with them very hard. And it's an area where we don't do a very good job because they are out there saying they have all this traceability, they have the ability to find where problems are and solve them and do corrective actions. Japan is a big trading partner of ours. They, due to the BSE, they have a rather detailed program. They do not have anything for pork because their pork market is relatively small. Thank God for us. It's a large export market for both our beef and pork. I explained a little bit earlier that we have that restriction at 20 months. But one of the things I want you to pay a little bit of attention to is that this is a bookkeeping system in which the animal's ID'd at birth. They verify the time in which it has expired, whether that be through slaughter or through other means. At that point in time, no matter how the death occurred, you have to perform the BSE test. That information is then transferred to that certificate, and the information is put up on a website at all the stores. So you have these kiosks so consumers can go look at that and see where those, see that test has been performed. And this does go through all the way through every cut. Now sometimes it's not on individual packages, then we'll just have the numbers listed there, the animal ID numbers listed there on the various cases. Not necessarily, but if there's 10 numbers, then all the meat in the case is represented by those 10 numbers, so they can go check and look at it. Likewise, in Korea, they just set up a new system, and one of the things that they're looking at here is very similar. One of the key things is that, again, both of these countries don't have a very large hog population, but they have a reasonable cattle population, very high quality Wagyu cattle in Japan, and the high quality Hanu cattle in Korea. Very high priced products, carcasses in Japan, Wagyu carcasses go for about $26,000 a piece. So they're very high quality items. Hanu's not that high, they're probably 18 or 19,000. So compared to our market, they're quite a bit more expensive. They do have the tracking, and the key on some of this is that consumers at some point in time will be able to track that all the way back to the individual animals on every retail cut. I find it very interesting when we go over there and look at these kiosks where they can go get this information. Very few people are, I've never seen one of the consumers go over and use it. You can also go on a website and do it. Maybe they do it in their home, but I almost think it's a security blanket, the fact that it's there and they could use it. So, you know, there's some nice dynamic there, or some political inferences there that are kind of interesting. Challenges. So now we get to think a little bit about this. And I look forward to, maybe we'll discuss a little bit of this in our Q&A session. We're going to see a change in the politics in Japan since the 1940s. The opposition party will probably take over. That will be on Sunday of this week. And we probably will see this opposition party take over, which will be a pretty dramatic change. They're going to be more conservative towards the U.S. in a lot of things. And it's going to be, our discussions with them to move from the 20 to 30 months will be, on beef cattle, will be a little more difficult. The thing relative to traceability is this, this opposition party called the Democratic Party of Japan has stated that they are going to subject imported beef to the same requirements as domestic beef. So we definitely have to start watching this. And it's something that if they do, what are we going to do? How will we work through this? In Korea, we talked a little bit about their current program. They have a country of origin requirement at the restaurant level. So all the menus must talk about all the different countries they have of their meat products, for that matter, all of their products. So they have a country of origin requirement even at the restaurant level. They also will, in 2010, have this, as I mentioned to you, have this situation where you have to track all of the products. Now, right now, they're only requiring us to put the bill of lading, in other words, the transportation numbers, on those products as they move through their system. And that isn't a requirement we have to follow. It's what the importers and the retailers and what have you. So, but what if they require us to move forward with a program on all of their imported product like they have with their domestic? So both of these countries have really done what WTO has asked. They've been transparent. They're only asking us to do, and again, I'm not saying they are asking us, but they could ask us to do something that they that they have their domestic producers use, and it's somewhat scientifically based. I mean, you can't. It's risk-based. They're doing it for food safety reasons, providing information to the consumer, all of those good things. Well, you might say, well, let's just throw our hands up. We don't need those guys. Well, do you really want to say that? That's about a $4 billion market between pork and beef, just between those two countries. High margin items, high variety meat buyers, and variety meats are low value, high margin items. So they put a lot of money back into our animal agriculture economy. The difficulty goes back to, remember the chart I was showing you relative to how many cuts we produce a day, and how do you track those various cuts? If you look at it today, there's really two major cuts that go into those countries, and about 90% of the cattle donate those cuts to that market, and it's called the short rib and the short plate. So now you got 360,000 of these short plates and short ribs that go into this market. The challenge for you is, how do you do it? How do we move that product? If we had to trace them, how would we do that? Trace them back to an animal ID. How would we do that? And I think that's a challenge you can think about and we can debate. It could happen to us. And I want to be very clear that there's nothing out there today that says that it will, but it could be one of our challenges that we need to think about.